When the words finally surfaced, they didn't sound like frustration. They sounded like fury. "I never want to see Sara again." According to those close to the situation, Yaman didn't whisper it. He snapped. What shocked everyone wasn't just the sentence itself, but the intensity behind it. This wasn't a carefully chosen line for the cameras. It was raw, uncontrolled, and completely out of character for someone known for measured silence. And once those words began circulating, the entire story around Can and Sara shifted overnight. Sources claim the outburst happened after days of mounting pressure. Questions he refused to answer. Messages he left unread. Conversations he abruptly shut down. Can had been avoiding the topic publicly, but privately, tension was boiling. Insiders say the anger wasn't sudden, it was the result of unresolved emotions colliding with constant scrutiny. And when the breaking point came, it came hard. What makes this moment so explosive is the context. Just weeks earlier, everything had been framed as calm and respectful. No drama. No bitterness. Yet behind closed doors, a very different energy was building. According to insiders, Can felt cornered, by expectations, by rumors, and by narratives he believed were being pushed without his consent. Sara's name, they say, became a trigger rather than a memory. Those close to Can describe a man who felt misunderstood and misrepresented. He believed every move he made was being interpreted through the lens of a relationship he wanted erased from the conversation. And when he realized that silence wasn't stopping the speculation, frustration turned into rage. The statement "I never want to see Sara again" wasn't about hatred. It was about finality. About drawing a line so sharp that no one could blur it again. Fans immediately reacted. Some were stunned by the cruelty of the words. Others argued that the outburst proved how deep the wounds still were. Social media exploded with debates over whether Can was justified or whether the reaction crossed a line. But one thing was undeniable: whatever calm image had existed before was gone, replaced by something far more volatile. As more details began to surface, it became clear that Can's explosion wasn't about a single moment. It was the result of a slow buildup that had been ignored for too long. According to people close to him, there were repeated attempts to move on quietly, to close the chapter without turning it into a spectacle. But every attempt was interrupted by new rumors, recycled headlines, and questions that refused to die. Sara's name kept reappearing in places Can never expected it to, and each time, the frustration grew deeper. Insiders claim the breaking point came when Can realized that no matter how far he tried to distance himself, the past was being pulled back into the present. Interviews were twisted. Old images resurfaced. Even neutral gestures were reinterpreted as signals. Can reportedly felt trapped inside a story that no longer reflected his reality. And that sense of being trapped is what turned restraint into anger. Those who witnessed his reaction say it wasn't performative. There were no cameras, no journalists, no audience to impress. That's what made it unsettling. The words were spoken in private, but with a force that suggested months of suppressed emotion. "I never want to see Sara again" wasn't meant for headlines, it was meant to end conversations, to shut doors, to stop the cycle once and for all. At the same time, another layer of tension was unfolding. According to sources, Can believed certain people around him were benefiting from keeping the story alive. Whether for attention, relevance, or leverage, he felt the narrative was being kept open deliberately. That belief fueled his sense of betrayal, not just toward the past relationship, but toward the environment surrounding it. Sara, in that moment, became the symbol of a chapter he felt was being forced on him against his will. Fans began noticing the shift almost immediately. His body language changed. His tone hardened. The warmth that once defined his public appearances faded into something colder and more distant. Supporters argued this was the reaction of someone pushed too far. Critics said it showed an inability to handle closure with grace. As the reaction spread, people close to Sara began feeling the impact as well. While Can's words dominated headlines, Sara remained silent. No counterstatement. no emotional response. And that silence changed the dynamic completely. According to insiders, Sara was caught off guard by the intensity of Can's outburst. She had expected distance, not rejection expressed with such finality. For those around her, the shock wasn't just about what he said, but how publicly absolute it sounded once it leaked. Sources claim Sara had been trying to avoid confrontation from the beginning. She believed that staying quiet would allow both sides to heal without reopening wounds. But Can's explosion shattered that plan. Suddenly, the narrative was no longer about two people moving on, it was about anger versus silence. And in that contrast, Sara's restraint began to look deliberate rather than weak. Behind the scenes, tension escalated further. According to people familiar with the situation, attempts were made to calm things down before they spiraled out of control. Friends suggested clarification. Advisors hinted at damage control. But Kim reportedly refused to soften his position. In his mind, clarity meant finality, not diplomacy. Any attempt to reframe his words felt like another manipulation of the truth he was trying to protect. What troubled observers most was how quickly the tone around Sara shifted online. Some fans accused her of provoking the reaction. Others defended her, arguing that silence was the only dignified option left. Old moments were dissected, conversations reimagined, and every past interaction was reinterpreted through the lens of Can's anger. Sara became the subject of speculation without ever speaking for herself. Insiders suggest that this imbalance was deeply unsettling. Can's rage had a voice. Sara's response did not. And in the absence of her words, others filled the space with assumptions. As the situation escalated, a new layer of unease began to surface around Can's inner circle. According to insiders, concern wasn't just about public backlash anymore, it was about how far the damage could spread if the anger wasn't contained. Advisors reportedly urged caution, reminding him that words spoken in rage rarely disappear. But Can was described as unmovable. In his view, walking back the statement would only reopen doors he had violently shut. He didn't want distance. He wanted erasure. What fueled his resistance was the belief that his emotions had been edited before, that previous attempts at silence had been reshaped and sold as something he never intended. This time, he wanted no ambiguity. The sentence was meant to be uneditable. Meanwhile, Sara's continued silence began to take on a different meaning. Rather than calming the situation, it intensified curiosity. Was she hurt? Was she protecting herself? Or was she refusing to participate in a spectacle she never asked for? Those close to her say the silence was intentional, not as strategy, but as a boundary. Media coverage grew more aggressive. Headlines shifted from shock to judgment. Analysts dissected Can's tone, his past interviews, even his pauses. This was no longer just about a breakup. It was about control over identity and memory. Both sides became trapped by momentum. Can couldn't soften without appearing weak. Sara couldn't speak without risking misinterpretation. And in that deadlock, the public filled the void. By the time the noise began to fade, one thing had become painfully clear: this wasn't an explosion that solved anything. It was an explosion that exposed everything. Yaman's words drew the sharpest line possible, but lines like that don't erase the past, they underline it. Insiders suggest the anger wasn't about seeing Sara again. It was about refusing to relive a version of himself he no longer wanted associated with her name. Sara's silence, in contrast, became the most powerful element of the entire story. While Can tried to end the narrative with force, Sara let it exhaust itself. She didn't deny. She didn't accuse. She simply refused to be pulled into a public emotional exchange. Over time, that refusal began to change how people saw the situation. As days passed, outrage cooled into reflection. Fans began asking why closure had to come through rage and why silence felt more dignified than shouting. What remained was not resolution, but exposure, the exposure of how easily private pain becomes public property and how difficult it is to reclaim control once words are spoken in anger. In the end, there were no winners. Only two people moving in opposite directions, one using anger to protect himself, the other using silence. And for everyone watching, the story became less about what was said, and more about what was never healed. Just when many thought the story had finally reached its limit, subtle shifts suggested otherwise. According to insiders, the aftermath of Can's outburst continued to ripple quietly through both of their lives. Not with new statements or dramatic confrontations, but with small, telling changes that only those paying close attention would notice. Schedules were adjusted. Circles narrowed. Certain names stopped being mentioned entirely. And that absence spoke volumes. Sources close to Can say the anger eventually gave way to something heavier. Not relief, not peace, but exhaustion. The kind that follows an emotional release when nothing actually feels resolved. While he had drawn his line publicly, privately the consequences of that line became impossible to ignore. Doors were closed, yes, but with them went conversations, shared histories, and the comfort of familiarity. The silence he demanded arrived, but it wasn't as quiet as expected. Meanwhile, Sarah's approach remained unchanged. She did not step forward to clarify, defend, or accuse. According to those around her, she chose consistency over reaction. That choice slowly began to shift public perception. Where anger had once dominated attention, restraint started to earn respect. Fans who initially demanded a response began questioning whether one was ever owed. In a space fueled by noise, her refusal to contribute became its own statement. Observers noted a striking contrast. Can's words had been sharp and irreversible. Sarah's silence was patient and enduring. One burned fast. The other lingered. And over time, the intensity of the explosion faded, while the weight of silence remained. Media coverage reflected this shift as well. Headlines softened. Commentary grew more reflective. The narrative began moving away from blame and toward consequence. Insiders suggest this was the point where the story truly changed. Not because of something new being said, but because of what was no longer working. Rage stopped generating answers. Speculation lost momentum. What remained was a quiet understanding that some endings don't come with closure, they come with distance. And in that distance, a final question emerged. When the noise is gone and the audience moves on, who is left carrying the emotional cost of words that can never be taken back? Because while silence can protect, anger leaves echoes. And echoes have a way of returning when least expected.